Well, thanks so much for the introduction and the opportunity to be here today. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. And David, I think we're all set with the recording, if that's right. So good to start talking. Perfect.
Yeah.
I'll go ahead and share some slides here. Let me make sure that I have the right window. Just to confirm, everyone can see the slide deck that I just made full screen.
Yes.
Perfect. All right. I think we're squared away. So my plan is I'll talk for about 45 minutes or so. I'll keep an eye on the time here on my phone on the side to make sure I don't go over, and want to make sure that we have some time for questions. I'm looking forward to this. My own context for my research and how I got interested in this work, sort of the intersection of AI and cultural heritage and archival materials is through my own sort of family history and genealogical context as well. My grandmother survived Auschwitz-Birkenau, and much of my research has taken place in the context of Holocaust studies and working in the archive, both on the side of thinking about how we can use AI in new ways to improve access and how we search these materials, but also from being on the other side of the archive, being represented within it, both myself and my family. And so, in that regard, I think I particularly like the opportunity to speak with people who are looking at the archive in a personal or familial context as well. And so, for me, it's very grounding to be back in that context. Um, so let me go ahead and start with the slide deck. My plan here is to spend, a little bit of time trying to introduce the work, give some background on how AI might be able to help us in this context, what the challenges are and what the opportunities are. Talk about my project, Newspaper Navigator, and then also switch over to some work with some Ladino newspapers. And I think generally speaking, having spoken with David and Tan here, it seems like there are a lot of interesting work that you all are thinking about in applying new OCR methodologies and everything as well. And so I hope this can be part of a broader conversation around what the opportunities might be and sort of shared considerations we've seen among newspapers and other digitized materials. So my work, generally speaking, as I mentioned, is sort of at this intersection of AI and cultural heritage, and it emerges from these questions at the collection level. So if you visit the Library of Congress and its serials division over in Washington, D.C., where I'm based for the year, and you enter the Madison building, you'll find in the stacks effectively these rows of newspapers that are in the process of being digitized. And this kind of initiative is not just restricted to the Library of Congress, it's in partnership with the National Endowment for the Humanities in the United States, as well as all sorts of regional partners. And so these initiatives have been incredibly successful. And what we find are 20 plus million pages of digitized historic American newspapers. And if we look in other contexts as well, say on the internet, we see efforts by the Library of Congress or the Internet Archive or other institutions to try to document web pages and archive those. So we find billions of web page snapshots. And I say all of this because here we're really confronted with this challenge of how we begin to navigate the sea of information. And I'm sure this is something that we've all encountered in one way or another when looking through an archive. And the question that I'm interested in is how machine learning or AI might allow us or afford us new ways of browsing these materials. But I'd like to stress the fact that it's like not just a question of the computational challenge, it's a question of how OCR works, how it affects different languages, and everything that I think is a shared context here as well. So for example, Ladino newspapers, it's really difficult to OCR them. There's been some exciting work with Transcribus and other platforms as well. But generally speaking, we find that it's also a challenge of how we find the ability to search specific contexts for different newspapers that might have been digitized in new ways, different languages that might not have been given as much attention. And so it's really at that intersection that I'm interested in exploring with my work. So Chronicling America, as I had mentioned, is this larger newspaper corpus that the Library of Congress created or has been creating for decades now through the National Digital Newspaper Program. And it has over 20 million pages, as I had mentioned. Content is distributed from libraries and other donors across states and territories. And it's produced by this entity called the National Digital Newspaper Program. And I'm going to introduce Chronicling America here largely because this was sort of my orientation to newspapers and to the challenges of searching them digitally. And then that will sort of branch out into some of the other work that I've mentioned. But I'll start here and talk about the work that I began now back in 2019 through my dissertation research and have continued on to present. One of the things that makes Chronicling America really special in my mind is that All the pages are in the public domain. So again, making it this really interesting resource for the public. And it supports, in a computational sense, bulk data access. And what I mean by this is that the Chronicling America staff has done a lot of exceptional work to make it possible for me to be able to download them and compute against them across all 20 plus million pages, which is no small feat. And so I like to give credit to the library for that in particular for making it possible. To give an overview of the kinds of pages, we have pages here from across all the different states. This is from 2019 or 2020, I should say. So the figure's a little outdated, but generally speaking, we see that they're newspapers from across the US in all sorts of different contexts. In terms of sort of date range, we see it goes, at least at the time of running this, from 1789 to 1963, with a lot of newspapers here from 1875 to 1925. That rather precipitous drop that you see is purely based on what's considered public domain and US copyright considerations. Of course, we have quite a linguistic distribution as well. So here are some of the languages represented within Chronicling America, but this has since grown even more. And so again, I think it speaks to the ways in which these kinds of materials are diverse and of interest to this audience as well. But I do want to spend a minute and talk about who uses these newspapers. And I'm sure this is a context that might be familiar to you all as well, right? So we know that there's scholars, whether historians or political scientists, who use these newspapers to try to do all sorts of scholarly research. But then we have teachers and students in the classroom learning in the social studies context. We, of course, have journalists, and lastly, genealogists, most relevant to this context, perhaps, and more generally, members of the public who are interested in browsing these newspapers. And I raise this because I think it's such an interesting and important opportunity to work with these materials and try to make them accessible, not just to one specific audience, but think about what newspapers might offer to all sorts of different groups and how we might encounter our cultural heritage. If you visit the website for the Chronicling America, chroniclingamerica.loc.gov, so to speak, you'll find front pages from 100 years ago today. So here's some examples of what you might find. And for those who might be more interested in how the digitization pipeline works, these are effectively high-resolution JP2 images that are done off of microfilm. Chronicling America, there are a lot of sort of stipulations about how to do proper microfilming, quality settings, and various things of that nature. But I will also say, and thank you for providing the link in the chat, that this gives us both a clear sense of how interesting and how high resolution the scans are, but also perhaps some of the other ways of searching, which is optical character recognition, or OCR for short. And for those of you who might not be familiar with that term, OCR refers to this kind of machine learning algorithm that is able to transcribe the letters on a scanned document or the characters into a text format. And so, as you can imagine, the idea here is to basically provide OCR for these newspaper pages, as many of us have seen, to allow us to do keyword search over these pages. And going from the ability to just look at a specific title or a day or a date through the metadata and being able to actually do keyword search against OCR really unlocks the materials. And again, I think it's an incredibly valuable resource. And sometimes OCR has its own limitations. I'm not suggesting otherwise, but nonetheless, it really does unlock the materials. And so what I've been interested in my work and what I'm going to share about today really concerns this question of how we might try to do something similar, but for the visual culture or the visual content embedded within digitized newspapers, whether Chronicling America or otherwise. So let me walk through what it looks like to try to encounter the visual culture in new ways, both extracting it and then reimagining how we might search over it. So in 2017, the Library of Congress Labs team, or LC Labs for short, launched this crowdsourcing initiative called Beyond Words. And the idea behind it was to make this website publicly available where volunteers could draw bounding boxes around 5 different types of visual content. At the time, this was photos, illustrations, maps, comics, and editorial cartoons. The volunteers could then note down the caption, indicate the artists. And so this was a really fun engagement opportunity that saw use in classrooms across the United States. Various curious members of the public who stumbled across the project or encountered the work had a lot of fun doing this kind of task of identifying visual content. It was really successful. And so over the course of the project, it accrued thousands of verified annotations. So through this whole pipeline, basically thousands of photos, illustrations, etc. As shown here, these are just a small sampling of what some volunteers had identified with the collage that I put together. And I encountered this soon after it had launched and was really quite captivated by this visual content. I think both from the perspective of making me realize that newspapers weren't naively just sort of text-heavy sources, but really had this rich visual culture. But also coming from my background, my PhD is in computer science, and much of my work and training is coming more from a sort of STEM orientation. I saw all of these annotations and wondered if this might be a sort of opportunity to apply machine learning in some way to train or fine-tune a machine learning model to identify and extract this visual content. And so this was really the kernel of what became all of my work with Newspaper Navigator. And in 2019, excuse me, the Library of Congress issued a call for concept papers for its Innovator in Residence program. And my mind really jumped back to Chronicling America, these annotations from this Beyond Words crowdsourcing initiative. And I really wanted to ask this question of what would it actually look like if we trained a machine learning model to try to extract this visual content and then make it available to the public in new ways. And so to borrow some language from the Library of Congress's digital strategy, the idea was, about quote unquote throwing open this treasure chest and trying to extract this across the millions of pages, at the time about 16 million pages of newspapers. And so to give some idea here for those who, I just want to make sure I ground this, and I will say, if I say anything that's confusing or anything, please feel free to interrupt, or also I'm more than happy to go into more detail in the questions phase. My goal here is certainly not to, I want my description of the machine learning and stuff to be intuitive. I don't want it to be off-putting or, not, this is intended to be accessible and interpretable. So the idea behind the machine learning is if we take a newspaper page like the one that I'm showing here, which has a rather complex layout, right? We see these comic strips, we see all these advertisements, various headlines as well. We want to basically train a machine learning model that can identify the constituent parts and draw these bounding boxes automatically so that we don't need a human to sit there and annotate the full page. With the understanding being that if we tried to get humans to do this across, 16 million pages, this would take an inordinate amount of time. It would not be fun for anybody. So if we could train a machine learning model to do this, it would just make it a lot easier, more efficient, and allow us to search in new ways. And so the question is, how do we actually train a machine learning model to do this? And I want to just mention very briefly that the categories that I've trained the model to recognize are those 5 classes from Beyond Words. So photos, illustrations, comics, cartoons, and maps, plus then 2 additional categories of headlines and advertisements, which seem also, relevant to end users. And let me talk a little bit about Newspaper Navigator and the broader schematic of the project as it unfolded. The idea was we could take these newspaper pages, run this visual content recognition, as I call it, or this machine learning on the newspaper pages to identify the constituent parts, as I had mentioned, then build out a search system to allow people to browse this visual content in new ways, not just via keyword search, but also through visual similarity search powered by AI as well. And I'll give a demo of what this looks like in practice. And then lastly, put it in front of the public and use this as an opportunity to really, in the context at least of my own research, to understand how people are interacting with these AI systems, use it as a way of sort of furthering computer science research, but also, of course, understanding all these different kinds of uses in a more sort of qualitative sense of getting vignettes and understanding how people could just navigate these photos in new ways. So I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about the data set, a little bit of time talking about the search application, and then turn to my work with Ladino newspapers. But very briefly with the data set, the idea, of course, as I mentioned, was if we can train this machine learning model to then draw these bounding boxes on the page, we can actually go beyond just drawing the bounding boxes. What we can do is then actually go into the underlying optical character recognition, or OCR for short, as I mentioned, grab all the text falling within each bounding box. And this gives us a sort of caption for understanding what's in the image. This is not going to be perfect by any means. OCR is never perfect. These bounding boxes are imperfect. Captions are never fully descriptive, but this does give us some text associated with each image. And so then effectively now we have captions. So let me spend 1 minute here providing some intuition for what it looks like to train this model. And so on the left-hand side here, I'm showing an image of what's called object detection. This is the task in AI, or computer vision in particular, where given an image, you train a machine learning algorithm to identify not just that there's a dog or a bike or a truck in the image, but to actually identify it locally on the image with these localized bounding boxes as shown, that green bounding box, that, et cetera. This gives us the ability to then recognize where things are on the image. And you can see that there's a very natural resonance between that task on the left and then ultimately what we're interested in, which is, say, drawing a bounding box around an advertisement on a newspaper page. And so these days, the way a lot of the machine learning works, this was done in 2020, so a few years ago, but generally speaking, the paradigm has remained where you take a machine learning model that's really, really good at this task on the left. Someone has already trained it on a large amount of data. You can take that model, then train it some more on the beyond words annotations or something very relevant to what we're interested in. And then through this process called quote unquote fine tuning, this model then actually is able to do what we want. It goes from the sort of general knowledge of identifying a dog in an image on your cell phone or something like that, to then being able to do this very specific goal of drawing a box around an advertisement on a newspaper page. And so I'm going to go ahead and sort of gloss over some of the questions around training this just in the interest of time. But generally speaking, once we have the model trained, the question is, how do we actually build out a broader pipeline to do this analysis? So let me show some examples of what predictions look like from this machine learning model to give you a sense of what the performance is. So here are some example newspaper pages from Chronicling America. And these bounding boxes are the predictions made by the machine learning model. And these images were not seen during training. So these are just random images that it had never seen before. And in the top left, I apologize, it's a little small, but you can see a label, so photograph or advertisement, et cetera, along with a percentage. And that's the confidence score coming back from the machine learning model about how confident it is it's a correct prediction. And so I'm going to flip through some examples here just to give you a sense of how it's doing. But as you can tell, it actually is doing quite a good job of identifying the relevant visual content. It's segmenting out individual advertisements. It's preserving, the photographs and the headlines. Here's some other examples where it's handling some more complex photo layouts. Here's an example where it gets a full comic strip without segmenting the individual cells. But I offer this just to say it's not perfect. Certainly, there are cases where we see redundant predictions or bounding boxes, cases where we might have a headline missing or something of that nature. But by and large, really training this and seeing the predictions on some example pages was really a moment in the project where I think I realized, and my colleagues at LC Labs and my advisor and all realized that, okay, we actually have the ability to try to build this into a pipeline and extract the visual content it's performing well enough. And so the broader pipeline for processing Chronicling America in the spring of 2020 took the form, as I'll show here, which is that for each newspaper page, we could download the image along with the corresponding OCR. We could run the visual content recognition using that machine learning model that's been trained. We can then crop and save out all the relevant visual content. We can also extract the OCR, as I had mentioned, to give us some captions. We can generate something called image embeddings, not super important here. This is just some computer vision to understand the content of the image and then save all of this. And so this gives us a closed loop for processing one page. And then much of the challenge actually became, how do we run this at the time across all 16.3 million pages? And in total, we were actually able to process about 99.998% of the available pages at the time. So in that sense, we were quite happy with building out a pipeline that seemed successful in terms of being able to process it. I'm going to offer a quick anecdote sort of in the interest of just giving a sense of why this extracted visual content might be interested to like a digital humanities audience or historians, for example. And one of the anecdotes here that I'll offer is that at the Library of Congress, the staff offer what are called topic pages for Chronicling America in this idea of teaching with primary sources, where you can look at a specific, event in American history or a person, and this will give you for not just a description to use in the classroom, but links to underlying articles or information in Chronicling America as a primary source that would be interesting for students in the classroom. And one of the persistent challenges in doing this is that producing, say, maps of the Civil War is an example that I heard that was really challenging for staff to be able to produce a representative set of, because this would require going manually through tens of thousands of newspaper pages from 1861 to 1865 to find the relevant maps for the American Civil War. With the Newspaper Navigator dataset, we just ask for all the visual content type map from 1861 to 1865, and we find here's a sort of a visualization that I put together of this. And if we zoom in, most of these are actually maps of the American Civil War, telling us that, this is an entirely new way of browsing. Um, I will mention for those of you who might be interested in looking at some of the underlying data, we host all of this at news-navigator.labs.loc.gov. And there you can actually download all of these different visual content types for different years. So if you want all the photographs from 1921 or all the maps from 1872, we have instructions for how you can download them in bulk and get metadata. I'll give a little brief overview of yes. So I have access. So yes, at news-navigator.labs.loc.gov, we have these kinds of prepackaged data sets available for download, and also some more sort of coding or compute heavy ways of accessing the information as well. And thanks for the link. That's great. Then on the sort of documentation for the project, this has a whole bunch of information. We made all the code available for the project, exploratory code for how to train models to do similar things. And so we liked seeing patterns of use and reuse here, and also a paper that describes the creation of the data set from a technical perspective. But one of the things that I really appreciate about the Library of Congress and working with them is that all of this is in the public domain, not just the data set, but actually the underlying code. And so again, it's really nice to be able to share the code publicly and have an opportunity for other practitioners or other cultural heritage institutions to use this code to be able to build out similar ways of processing their own collections. I'm going to spend about 5 minutes here talking about the Newspaper Navigator search application, just because this is the sort of second phase of the work after building out the data set, which asks the question of how we go ahead and search this information that we've extracted, or particularly these photographs, beyond just sort of downloading them in bulk and flipping through them one by one. And so this work took place in the summer and fall of 2020. And I'm going to go ahead and actually, because we have some time, show a live demo of doing some searching here. And I hope that this is interesting from the perspective of thinking through how we all collectively might encounter newspapers in new ways or the visual materials. So if you visit news-navigator.labs.loc.gov/search, you'll find the search interface that I launched with the LC Labs team. And this search application supports searching over about 1.5 million photos. And so roughly speaking, these are all of the photos that were extracted in the Newspaper Navigator dataset from 1900 onward. And so our initial sort of way of searching here is we can do some basic sort of metadata facets or filters based on location or start year or end year. But the real way that we'll search is by keyword. So I'm going to type in baseball here, just as an example that I like, being a big baseball fan. And doing this keyword search, we get back about 5,400 search results. So for context, this means there are 5,400 images whose captions contain that literal string baseball. And let me show you an example of what this looks like. We find the ability to browse these images here. And so if I go ahead and click info here, we can start to get more context for that specific image. So the one that I've collected here from selected, we find that it was published, February 24th, 1902 in the Butte Intermountain. And here's the caption from the OCR that was extracted from that image. And we see the word baseball highlighted in context. And we provide some additional affordances here to try to make it easy to understand the image and context and get more information. So you can download the image, which will just pull it down immediately. You can view the issue. So this actually brings you back to Chronicling America, where we can then find the page where this image was published, and we can see what the corresponding article was. The player may come to Butte, and then we can read more about that article and see more from that issue, just to provide that context. But then also you can learn more about the title here, the Butte Intermountain, and learn about its publication in Montana in 1881, et cetera. And so generally speaking, this is to provide an interface that makes it easy to browse and explore. But I do want to show a couple of more features here, especially that visual similarity search that I had mentioned. So I showed what the info button does, but you can also click this button to add it to your collection. So what I'm going to do is add some of these action shots of baseball players to my collection. As you can imagine, in one sense, we are really successful with this keyword search. We have these action shots of baseball players, we have these portrait shots, we have team photos, photos of fields, etc. But one of the limitations of keyword search is that it's fairly heterogeneous, right? We're not understanding necessarily what's going on in the image. And moreover, we're losing all sorts of images that might be relevant that just don't use that literal phrase baseball. And this is further a problem because of OCR and its limitations. So the idea here is to ask how we might begin to isolate, say, action shots of baseball players. So I've selected a handful. And if you go to my collection, we see I've accumulated a little collection of these photos. You can click this button to download metadata, which gives you a spreadsheet with the information and ways of sort of preserving what you have. And also a save button, which generates a URL that is saved to your clipboard that allows you to return to your library. So I should mention that all of this is done in such a way that we're storing no information on the back end per the Library of Congress's rules around data collection. So this is all just done in a URL that you can reconstruct and then share with friends or return to later based on what you've built out. But let me go ahead and show that feature that I had mentioned of training AI navigators to retrieve content in a more sort of visual way. So when I click this tab, what we're getting back is what's called sort of an interactive machine learning interface, where on the left-hand side, we have the photos from my collection. And on the right-hand side, we have the photos that this AI is determining are most visually similar to this example highlighted on the left. So right now, we only have one example highlighted, and the AI is doing an okay job. We see some examples of baseball players, but a lot of examples that are actually not of baseball players. So let me go ahead. I'm just going to name this. We're not doing any actual text search, just to name it so I can keep track of it. I call it baseball players. I'm going to go ahead and start to train this machine learning model to identify baseball players on the fly. So let me go ahead and highlight over some of these examples. We see we have the opportunity to select plus or minus. The plus means we're trying to steer this AI navigator toward this photo, or photos like it. If we select minus, it's trying to avoid photos like it. So for the baseball players, we of course want to select a plus. And for these ones that are not of baseball players, these men standing around, these various images that are not as relevant, we select a minus. So I'll go ahead and do this for a few more. And so now we see on the left-hand side some positive examples and some negative examples. When I click this button, train my AI navigator, what is actually happening is we're training this AI system in real time on these examples, and it will re-rank all 1.5 million photos on the fly. And so this is fairly responding. It responds fairly quickly here, as we see. When we click the train button, we got those search results back pretty fast. We can see that we're doing slightly better. There are some more examples of baseball players, but still is not performing great. Sometimes, I'd say definitely better. But we can do another couple of iterations of this where we continue to train this machine learning model against these images to then try to really isolate this idea of baseball players. So let me go ahead and do another round of training here to see how well we can get this to perform. And I'll only do one more round just in the interest of time here. So what we get back are, yes, so we're getting back more photos of baseball players. So generally speaking, the idea is we can use this as a way of isolating photos that we can then use to go back on the main search page and apply like a facet. And I see a question here. Let me go ahead and open it up, asking no women as players or supporters. That's an excellent question. And I think this actually speaks to some of the challenges we find with the historic data. There are definitely photos of female baseball players, but they're just much less common given the nature of what was being covered at the time. And so what you do find are a disproportionate number of men represented. And I think this does speak to all sorts of artifacts that actually aren't just in terms of what the machine learning is recognizing, but actually reflecting the nature of the historic newspapers themselves and what they were covering and who was appearing in them. So thank you for the question. I'm definitely more than happy to answer more in a few minutes here. But in any case, let me go ahead and move back to the slide deck. And I'll wrap up here by answering this question of how we can then move from, let me go ahead and I'll actually very briefly here, I'll mention some ways that we've seen people using the project. So we've had people build out code bases for processing the newspapers we found. We've had students build out really cool digital humanities projects for browsing. We've had people look at the maps in all sorts of interesting ways on blogs. We've had been fortunate to collaborate with Michael and Eileen Burson, professors of education, surrounding uses of Newspaper Navigator in the social studies classroom. And we've had students, our educators, provide overviews of using it with students, both from a social studies context, but also from computer science classes and beyond, but also a genealogy context as well. It's been really fun to talk with genealogists. People have found photos of family members and have found photos of their hometowns or their families' hometowns as well. And so that part has been particularly meaningful. But let me go ahead and turn to this question of how we can actually use Newspaper Navigator in a slightly different way to unlock the visual culture in Ladino newspapers. And so let me just very briefly introduce this collection. So, of course, I'm at the University of Washington and have had a fellowship through the Strom Center for Jewish Studies, and I'm affiliated with the center. And it has one of the larger collections of Sephardic materials in terms of a digital library in the world. And one of the real exciting parts for me is the newspaper collections that they have out at the University of Washington. And so I've been really fortunate to be able to work with these digitized newspapers around sort of applying Newspaper Navigator style approaches. And I'll offer this to this audience in particular just to think through ways that Newspaper Navigator can be extended to all sorts of digital collections to allow us to browse the visual culture. So I don't necessarily need for this audience to introduce why the Ladino press is so important or why we want to be looking at newspapers. There's some wonderful scholarship out there by, say, Sarah Stein in the book Making Jews Modern. That's fantastic. But let me go ahead and talk about some of the ways that the kinds of advertisements in these newspapers are quite valuable in Sarah Stein's book. She articulates, ways in which we can read these advertisements to understand all sorts of histories and understand embedded communities. But let me, in the interest of time here, talk about some of the challenges facing these Ladino newspapers and then also the ways that we might be able to search them. So one of the persistent challenges that some of the scholars that I've been working with who use these digital materials quite often is the fact that the OCR engines just do not perform well on Ladino. So we find that the Rashi script is interpreted as Hebrew, the lexical parsing just does not perform well. There's been a lot of exciting work here to improve OCR for Ladino texts, but as of 3 or 4 years ago when we started this work, there wasn't much out there. And so as a result, it's really hard to do proper OCR of these newspapers and keyword search. But as we can see, there's all sorts of interesting visual layout or visual materials as well here. And so the question that I began to ask through my work with the Strom Center was, can we apply that Newspaper Navigator model to try to extract the visual content in these Ladino titles? And so the answer was yes. Running the pipeline of running this visual content, we were able to process about 15,000 Ladino newspaper pages. Here's a breakdown. These are spanning many decades from the 1890s into 1940 or so, spanning papers that are published globally. And I'll just talk a little bit about some of the kinds of ways we can search this visual content when it's been extracted. So here I'm using some computer vision or from AI to try to cluster the images based on their content. This is produced, it's a sort of a fun-looking visualization that allows us to drill down and find actually clusters of content that's being published. And so if we zoom in, we find that there are lots of portrait shots of individuals speaking to the nature and the ways in which these newspapers serve local communities. We also see on the right-hand side all these kinds of community shots as well, which are quite interesting. And then also what I ended up finding were these kinds of patterns of reproduced advertisements that were appearing in titles, in issue after issue or even across titles. And it speaks to kinds of patterns that we see that align with Sarah Stein's work in Making Jews Modern and other historiographic sources around Ladino newspapers and Sephardic culture. But I just want to highlight the ways that being able to extract this visual culture and then being able to search over it actually gives us a new perspective or a new orientation toward these newspapers and how we might begin to encounter them. So I had a piece come out in a volume called Jewish Studies in the Digital Age about this work, diving in a little bit more detail, but just offering that as another perspective on how we can search. I think I'll actually wrap up here. I see we're right at around 1:40, which I think is reasonable timing wise. I thank you for putting so many of these links in the chat already for the data set and the search application. These are the general resources for the project. And I'll end by saying, there are a number of people that I would like to thank for making all of this work possible. At the Library of Congress, my colleagues at LC Labs and the National Digital Newspaper Program and IT Design and Development really made this project possible in so many ways. It just would not have been possible by myself under any circumstance. My advisor, Dan Weld at the University of Washington and the Allen Institute for Artificial Intelligence, and then a whole host of external collaborators who have also made this work possible. This work was supported by a number of organizations, including the National Science Foundation, the Library of Congress, and the University of Washington through the Strom Center. And with that, I guess we should turn it over to questions. So thank you for your time. I really appreciate the opportunity to share, and excited to hear what questions you may have.
Thank you very much. That was really brilliant and accessible. My first question is can this technology as is be applied to sort of magazines and directories and books, or is it specifically for newspaper format?
That's a great question. And yes, so I would say that it can definitely be applied to periodicals, magazines, books with illustrations in them as well. Based on the format type or the way they're scanned, there might be some difference in performance, but generally speaking, this kind of model and the machine learning model that we actually published with the data set and everything too can be directly applied. And I'll mention, especially for you, David, because I think you have some of the context here for actually applying these tools. I've done some work with some other computer scientists building this into some libraries for Python to make it really easy to work with, called Layout Parser. I'm happy to share a link, but you can effectively run this kind of visual content recognition on newspapers or magazines or whatever context in just a few lines of code. So sort of transcribus level work, hopefully, in terms of getting it up and running. So just mentioning that as another resource that we're excited to try to make available and see other people utilize. So thanks for the question.
I have other questions, but I see a lot of people have their hands up. So Ali, would you like to unmute and go first?
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yes. Ben, thank you very much. That was an absolutely fascinating presentation. A very exciting work. You're probably familiar with the sort of British equivalent, the British Newspaper Archive, which is, I think that's under the auspices of the British Library, which has had its own rather major IT problems recently, being hacked. But, that's got I don't know, ridiculous amounts of data, I think 80 million. Yes, nearly 78 million pages. It's a subscription model, but do you know how your model compares, or the Library of Congress model compares with their search? And does that have similar capabilities? The BNA site, does that have similar capabilities?
Yeah, that's a great question.
Yeah.
And thank you for your kind words as well. What I would say is, the British Library and the Turing Institute have done a wonderful collaboration, a many-year project called Living with Machines that I would highly recommend taking a look at. I happen to have worked with a number of them and become friends with them as well. And so they've been doing some really, really interesting work around applying AI to the British Newspaper Archive and some other materials at the British Library. And I think in many senses, it's been really nice and complementary to my work. So they've been thinking through, how do they make the maps much more accessible? And how can you come up with interesting interfaces and academic research surrounding that I find really exciting. I think the search portal, I've used it in various forms. I'm not actually sure the latest in terms of what the sort of AI capabilities or affordances are. But between the work on Chronicling America, the British Newspaper Archive, Europeana, and then some of the other work taking place internationally, there's been a lot of really interesting work on newspapers. And there are a lot of people who I think I've been fortunate to become friends with who are doing really exciting AI work. And so for me, it's exciting. It's an exciting time to see these tools being incorporated more and more into the search interfaces themselves, especially when we have the scale, as you mentioned, we're talking about tens of millions of newspaper pages in these various databases. So I think all of them have different strengths, but as we see more interest around AI and building them in, I actually think we'll see a lot of exciting ways of browsing here emerging for sure.
I have a supplementary question, if that's okay, David.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm particularly interested in Caribbean newspapers, and I suspect there'll be others in this group as well who will be, because of the concentration of Portuguese, Jewish, and general Sephardic ancestors in the Caribbean, in Jamaica, Barbados, and so forth. Now, some of these I gather are available or are available again through subscription of, subsidiaries of Ancestry.com and things like that. Can your model be applied to those?
Yes, that is a great question. And so I do know, let me go ahead and drop a link into the chat here for DLOC, which is the Digital Library of the Caribbean. The folks who won that project are fantastic. They have some really interesting work around newspapers as well. Theoretically, this could be applied to their newspaper collection. And I do know that they're like actively working on some really exciting work around digitizing and providing new ways of searching. So that might be one resource that would be relevant to you all. One of the things that they're making a real conscious effort to do is to be open. It's less sort of subscription based and is more very much open access style. From coming from public library or university library setting at a public institution for forwarding this work. So just mentioning that as well, because I know that they're doing fantastic work, and that generally speaking, we're all part of a shared conversation around how AI might improve things. But I mean, certainly these methods could be applied.
Brilliant. Thank you so much.
So we have a question in the chat from Jean. Do you think AI tech will eventually be able to OCR Ladino? And if so, do you think it will eventually be able to train or have AI that will be able to search and translate? One of the things I find terribly frustrating with any OCR search is the lack of ability to search for things that sound alike, e.g. DM or Soundex. Do you foresee this problem being addressed in the future? Can I actually add my own question? I do apologize, Jean, onto that, because I was actually going to ask about the pipelines you discussed, and whether large language models and things like ChatGPT and indeed these new technologies for crisping up photographs, whether that can just be automated within the system. But perhaps if you can address Jean's concern first.
Yeah, definitely. More than happy to. And thank you for the question. So I would say that the work that's going on now around being able to OCR Ladino is very promising. Work with Transcribus and I believe a couple other collaborations seem like are making really good headway. And so I think the question there largely has been just finding researchers who have a dedicated interest and the bandwidth to be able to pursue this in a meaningful way. Because clearly, if we just leave this up to the hands of Abby Finereader or Google Translate and such, their incentive structure is such that they're just going to push ahead on languages like English for all sorts of reasons. But just to say that I think we will be able to OCR Ladino more and more effectively. And I do think that this, certainly being able to search and translate is on the horizon. I would say that, certainly all these conversations around ChatGPT, what OpenAI releases, presents its own series of very complex questions about what happens to our data when we give it to them and they train on it in some way. And we want to make sure that we steward our materials and are sensitive to that. All sorts of questions about their payment structures and everything too. But it is becoming increasingly clear that what's being produced at these large language model scales, and especially around sort of joint image and text work, is that I do think that there's sort of monumental progress occurring now over the past year or two, and we'll hopefully continue to see. And so I think we'll see pretty drastic changes in terms of what it'll look like when we build out these digitization pipelines. And one place that I would say is really exciting is actually handwritten documents as well. It seems like that problem was just completely impossible for a very long time, or intractable, but there's real headway occurring now with these models. So offering that, I think, again, with its own caveats around when we provide the data to them, what it means with the payment structures. But I do think that we actually see real opportunity here. So I hope that touches on your question as well, David. What I will say to the question around the lack of ability to search surrounding, sound X or something of that nature? That's a really good question. And I actually don't know if I've seen any pipelines that have explicitly built in the ability to do sound X-based search around OCR. Clearly incredibly important in the context of, especially in genealogical context too. I do know that there's sort of like fuzzy search opportunities, but doing something SoundX based would be really interesting. I have to imagine someone's tried it at some point or another, but reflecting on your question, I actually don't think I've seen it. And as you said, it is frustrating that it's not sort of standard part of these pipelines, but certainly something that I think would make sense to be rectified in the future, and I would like to see in these search systems.
Thank you. Bernard, would you like to unmute?
Thank you. Sorry, I'm in Brussels. I keep getting a message saying my internet connection is unstable. So if you can't hear me, tell me and I'll turn off my picture to save bandwidth. Am I okay?
Yeah.
Yes, you're good.
Okay, thank you for a fascinating and really exciting presentation. It sort of fits in. I can see 5 of us on screen who are involved with the Nação Hebraica project, which is transcribing 17th and 18th century Judeo-Portuguese records from the Bevis Mount Synagogue in London. And so we're facing a lot of the problems that you're talking about. And I think that my questions link to that, because we're finding names, we're finding places, we're finding where people came from, where they went to, where they were sent to. And so I have a very specific question. You talked about the difficulty of recognizing Rashi script because it attempts to parse it into Hebrew. Is there some way of deactivating that attempt to parse so that you can look for specific words or specific names? Because obviously what we're looking for most of the time is names, dates, and places. Yes. So if we have, I don't know, let's say Daniel Cohen Azevedo, who we've seen in Amsterdam, Brussels, and London in the late 17th century, and somebody with a similar name turns up and it's mentioned in a Ladino newspaper in Oregon, could we search his name and have that come up without getting involved in parsing? And I have a second question, which is about locations.
Sure. Yeah. I'm happy to answer the first one and then turn to the question around locations. I mean, yes, I think so. And also, I would say that practically speaking, the approach that I've heard from you all around using something like Transcribus is definitely the best path forward. I think it's a good balance of you being able to be involved in the training or fine-tuning process, but doing something that's fairly transparent. I found that one of the issues with sending stuff to Google Translate, or Google's Vision API or stuff like that, is that ultimately they change the models on the back end. You don't know if you're going to get consistent results day to day, et cetera. But certainly, I think the answer is like, yes, there are ways to do this without having the sort of lexical parsing built in. But I think Transcribus and that kind of approach where you're training on some sort of, material that is not explicitly doing that lexical parsing is like the best path forward. The same.
I'm guessing that at some point you will be able to tell it that this is Ladino rather than Hebrew, and it will then not attempt to parse Hebrew and will possibly recognize it as Ladino. I think it's all coming. It's going to be exciting, and the next step will be to go to Solitreo or Macalar or one of the other scripts. The other one is the places. Jose Gregorio Lepervanche Valencia is doing this project called GeoSepharad, where he's mapping the movements of Sephardic people over time and geography. And it would be a similar sort of question. It's about searching out locations. So if you were to find, for example, in a Ladino newspaper in, I don't know, somewhere like New Orleans, there was a reference to Hamburg and to Amsterdam and to London, if it would be possible to do a search that would bring them together, because we might find patterns of movement. If it also went through the Caribbean, it would be an even more interesting set of connections.
Yes, definitely. And in fact, I just pulled up the project. Thank you for the reference to it. I actually hadn't heard of it before, but I definitely see how applying these kinds of tools and being able then to extract locations and build them in further to the Digital Humanities project would be fantastic. So thank you for the pointer as well.
Thank you. And thanks for the good work.
Of course.
I actually, we're also ourselves playing around with GIS, with geographical information systems, but we should get that person to come and speak to us quite soon. Bob, would you like to unmute?
Yeah, thank you very much for your presentation, Ben. And if you work with Matt Miller, my former coworker, send my regards. So in this group, I think we had our first Transcribus presentation, which was about Inquisition records, which were in 3 different languages. And so I can understand with newspapers, because a newspaper from 1850 is going to look pretty much like a newspaper from 1950. And that's not true with handwriting.
Right.
And I remember the person who gave the Transcribus discussion, and I said something to like, the breakthrough was that it doesn't recognize it as characters. It does it some other way. Can you just briefly go into how it deals with handwriting, which is totally unlike newspapers?
Yeah, definitely. So my intuition here, and this is going to be very sort of hopefully intuitive and not grounded in any sort of like concrete observation here. I actually haven't done really much work, any work training handwriting recognition models myself, but I think one of the sort of developments that we've seen over the past decade or so with these approaches is I think what you were alluding to, which is instead of training these systems in a very, very sort of step-by-step constrained way where we say, okay, first we want to take the handwriting and isolate where each character is. Then we want to transcribe each character. Then we want to suture that together into a word. And then we do that, you sort of zoom in and then zoom back out. It actually turns out rather counterintuitively, or maybe intuitively in some sense, the better way to do this is to actually let these machine learning models handle all of the fine-grained details. So instead of constraining it and making it identify first where all the characters are, sending that to a new system to do the next step, sending that to a new system to do the next step, you're actually losing information each time you do that. And it's better just to basically feed in large volumes of data where you have the full pages with the corresponding localized text, to train it on. And, certainly these models are getting trained on all sorts of stuff beyond handwriting recognition. But one of the broader insights I think that we've seen, there are all sorts of questions about whether this will continue to scale and whether the models will continue to show sort of increases in performance, is just training on an enormous amount of joint image and text data that are all sorts of different kinds of tasks, mean that these systems actually learn a lot in their sort of internal representations that become really valuable for handwriting recognition. And so all just to say that one of the lessons learned, I think, over maybe the past decade, whether it's specifically OCR or handwriting recognition or anything more generally, is that basically if you can just have these higher capacity models where you're training on enormous volumes of data and actually not constraining it to do step by step, it'll actually end up doing better in the long run. And so I'm curious, I think everyone, maybe I'm curious, I'm not sure to the extent to which this is solved yet, but, once we continue to sort of level up when it comes to more and more data and more capacity, eventually, presumably we'll hit some sort of limits. But right now, it just seems like we're on the really steep part of this curve where we continue to get benefits. And yeah, I mean, I think like it's so steep such that handwriting recognition 5 years ago to where it is now is really like night and day. So
thanks so much.
Yeah, of course.
I have another question, unless Ton or somebody else has.
No, go ahead.
Thank you. Yesterday, I think it was yesterday, Elon Musk tweeted that he thinks we'll get to artificial general intelligence by the end of next year. Where do you, I mean, you're obviously infinitely better informed than us on these technologies. I mean, how do you perceive these developing, these various technologies that we're playing with?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I guess from my perspective, I feel like the developments over the past couple of years, no matter even the most cynical of people, have to acknowledge that there have been profound changes, right, in terms of performance on various specific tasks and in our context as well, right? Like grounded in the work that we're all collectively doing, it's really changed things fundamentally on a day-by-day basis when it comes to OCR, handwriting recognition, image recognition, working with cultural heritage materials. So that stuff is all undeniable. I think I would say I simultaneously am excited about what that means for the work that we're doing in a sort of grounded way, while also thinking that I'm fairly skeptical about these notions of artificial general intelligence or AGI being just around the corner. I think ultimately the biggest challenge that we face, and this is not related to cultural heritage, this is more sort of in the land of like machine learning, cognitive science, whatever the term might be, and I'm no expert in this by any means, is that one of the big critiques that we see is to train something like ChatGPT, right? We're training on enormous amounts of data, incomprehensible amounts of data, and these huge models. What ultimately, quote unquote, intelligence looks like for humans, oftentimes, we're able to learn things based on just a handful of examples. It seems like the amount of data input is just very different data input, I say with scare quotes. But all just to say that I actually think a lot of the exciting research moving forward will actually be around how we learn from really small amounts of data, exploring different kinds of architectures or algorithms and everything too. And that I don't think we've solved everything by any means, in that it's both been incredibly exciting to see the developments, but also limiting in some sense, because all research has converged into one style approach. And like, I think ultimately, as with all academic research, we really benefit from when people are working on a whole vast array of things that might not seem immediately to be panning out and everything too. But I guess my perspective is maybe thinking artificial general intelligence might be not necessarily around the corner tomorrow, but that's an opportunity for us to explore different ways of doing machine learning and what it means and everything as well. But, that's just my opinion. So I offer that caveat for sure.
Do you want to give us a date?
Oh, do I want to give you a date? I mean, maybe I'll be incredibly skeptical and say that I don't think AGI will actually ever be achieved, to be honest.
Okay, sure.
But that, I mean, that has to do with one's notion of what it means and what one's definition is and all sorts of things there. But maybe what I can say is that I think a lot of the questions that I faced when I started my PhD around cultural heritage materials, or when I entered this space a decade ago and everything, I think I have been surprised at how fast things have changed. Maybe it's a good way of grounding it, and that it's an exciting time for us all to be doing this work. And even this conversation and the questions that we've discussed here in the past 15 minutes, my responses probably would have been drastically different 3 years ago, and that's exciting. So,
do you know of work being done outside the Anglosphere? So, for example, we're very interested in, for example, French language newspapers and so forth.
yes, so there definitely is. And in fact, one of my close colleagues and friends has been doing a lot of really interesting work looking at Spanish language newspapers. All just to say that the non-Anglophone research, I think there are a number of pockets of really interesting digital humanists pursuing this work and trying to take some of these models that are coming back, like BERT or some of these large language models, and figuring out how to practically use them in the non-Anglophone context.
Yeah.
I think it's been, at least at what I've heard from them, is both really, I mean, it's important work, one, because it demonstrates that just how much Anglophone materials are prioritized, right? The degradation of performance is quite noticeable, but also that means that there's a real opportunity and necessity for people doing that research. So if it's helpful, I'm more than happy to follow up with links or introduce people as well, if that would be helpful in thinking through those questions.
No, thank you. Those are my questions. Tom, do you have
One question really. I saw this graphic in the beginning about the number of newspapers being digitized, and I saw this enormous drop-off after 1950. Does that have to do only with privacy, or also with newspapers putting their backlog of newspapers behind a paywall?
Yes, so it's an important clarification. So those were representing the newspapers that were publicly visible through Chronicling America, which requires them to be public domain newspapers. So that's purely an artifact, actually not even of what's being digitized, but like what's being considered part of this public domain project. And so that drop off is almost entirely an artifact of copyright and what's considered public domain under U.S. law. And the Library of Congress, is the Copyright Office and the Library of Congress are effectively one entity, so they pay a lot of attention to questions around copyright for those reasons. But I would say that the Library of Congress is still very, very actively accessioning newspapers, even ones that are being printed currently, and is doing a lot of work around digitizing them. It's just in terms of what's accessible through these public-facing portals, through Chronicling America and the like. So I would say, like, in that context, very much just that drop-off was purely an artifact of copyright.
Thank you.
And I will say, yes, for the clarifying point, yes, as the date range continues to move, as time passes, Chronicling America is pulling new newspapers in and expanding its collection of public domain newspapers. I believe it extends past 1963 now into the 1970s, and that there's a more critical mass in the 1920s. And so, all generally speaking, they're actively working on what they can do within the bounds of copyright to make those materials more accessible. It's not sort of frozen in time either.
And will that new material automatically be processed with Newspaper Navigator, or does that require human intervention?
Yes, so it would require human intervention. Great question. So right now we have the project frozen on those 16 million pages that were available in April of 2020. But we're interested in figuring out ways of expanding the project and figuring out what the broader life cycle of Newspaper Navigator will be. And so it's definitely something that we're actively thinking about.
Thank you.
Of course.
That was it from me.
Comment from Bob. In the US, anything 95 years or less is presumed in copyright. Okay. If anybody, David Silvera has been very quiet, but he's our leader. If anybody has any more questions, speak now. David.
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult to ask a good question after hearing such a great presentation and related to it. But from my perspective, we're coming up to 4 years in Transcribus. What we do know is that it's very sensitive to the script and what you teach it, it'll learn and remember. And if some new scribe comes along, you better get a few pages of the new scribe transcribed and then teach it add those new scribes in, and you'll get good results again. That really works. And Ali has been working in 100 years different from the year I've been working in, and we can't use the same model because they don't work as well. So that's one. But now we've got 1,200 pages of text with words, names spelled quite differently throughout, not totally inconsistent. So in transcribing, we've been faithful to the writer and the way they misspelled words, as we would think today. Now I'm trying to figure out how to, and I think it's part of it is called name disambiguation, or some clustering technique that you mentioned, where you can come up with different spellings of the same name and say, yep, these are the same. And we keep running the model much as you did for looking at different pictures and finding baseball versus family pictures and so on. Some graphic way of doing that, software way of doing that. We haven't looked at that, and I'm certainly think that would be great helpful to us if we could do it, and to take us the next step further with getting the name information, trying to find names that are the same, and then ultimately people who are the same, references to people who are the same. Now, if you have any thoughts on that to share, that would be appreciated.
For the name disambiguation, I have a sense that you're doing quite a good job, as is, take care. That you're, I've probably used the same level of things that you have, or actually, do we have a question here? Actually, sorry, my apologies.
The question was, have you any thoughts on this?
Oh, sorry, I see
could find.
Fran waving their hand. Let's see. Oh, well, oh, perfect. Thanks. Okay. Take care. Oh, perfect. Sorry, I was just waiting to say goodbye. Apologies, David. So yes, for the oh.
All I wanted to say,
Oh yes.
when you're looking at the wide variety and complexity of names, I studied Anglo-Saxon, Middle English and all of that, and Old Norse. And that's what was normally happening. When they started to get stabilized, sort of 16th, 17th century, but there was no particular necessity to spell everybody's names the same way. And people didn't. The ones who could write, of course, a lot more of us can write now. And I guess that some of that standardization came as more and more people were capable of being what's rather patronizingly called literate, because the people who were not literate, in my experience, were amazing speakers. I've done a lot of work recording people around all sorts of communities who might never write a diary, but who speak like Shakespeare. And so, yeah, so I think that business of the not spelling names the same way was very widespread.
Yes, definitely. And I've encountered it in various contexts as well. So yeah, thanks for surfacing that. And yeah, David, I would say definitely in terms of the name disambiguation, I would trust what you've found online. I've used various tools that probably similar to ones that you've found, but really haven't done more beyond that. But in terms of the question of how you could use, the sort of visual, the separating the images and everything too, I'd be, more than happy to talk about how you might be able to use some of the work from Newspaper Navigator to do that, or also some of the other tools out there to maybe try help sort the images or the photos as well into meaningful categories.
Well, I'm thinking, even just having there's no photographs, so I've got a name and it's been spelled 20 different ways. Yes, it's the same, and you say this is a cluster and keep going just by on the spellings of the names, And then of course there are the abbreviations, because Rodriguez was never Rodriguez, it was ROIZ, The abbreviations were pronounced. And thanks, really enjoyed your presentation.
Oh, thank you very much. I appreciate it. And then I do see Bob had one more question in the chat about what are the next steps. That's an excellent question. So, with Newspaper Navigator, as I had mentioned, figuring out what the sort of longer term plans might look like with LC Labs. And in terms of my own work, I'm continuing to do research here, sort of at this intersection of AI and cultural heritage. And so in the fall, I'm starting back at the University of Washington in the information school, and I'm starting my lab called the Lab for Computing Cultural Heritage. And so this is sort of the work that I'm interested in pursuing long term, and always looking to continue these conversations and find interesting collections to work with to further the work. But all just to say that I see Newspaper Navigator as really the basis for the research that I'm continuing on and excited about when it comes to cultural heritage and AI.
Love it.
Thank you. Bernard, do you want to ask the final question?
Yeah, just a quick, very specific question. Do the collections, either in the Library of Congress or the Strum collection, include Ladino newspapers not from the US?
Yes. So the Strom Center one definitely does. The titles are published across the world. So actually, I believe Vara might be the only title that was published in the US out of New York, but the rest are non-US context. And I'd be more than happy to make a connection with all of them if that would be useful or helpful in any way. They're all incredibly friendly. And I'm the Library of Congress. I don't believe at the moment has incorporated any Ladino newspapers into Chronicling America. I believe there's some work to incorporate some Yiddish titles, but as far as I know, the best bet for Ladino titles, especially ones not published in the US, would be the Strom Center Digital Library. Their Sephardic Studies collection. Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, we've already overextended a bit. There's no more no more questions. Ton, would you like to close the meeting?
Yes. Thank you, Benjamin Lee. That was a wonderful presentation and very insightful.
Oh, thank you.
And we hope to see you again with your next
Definitely.
project.
Oh, that sounds wonderful. And yes, please do feel free to reach out with any questions. Would love to talk offline or continue the conversation for sure.
So thank you, Ben, and thank you to our viewers on Zoom. We hope to see you again in 2 weeks' time. Our speaker for the next time has not yet been confirmed, so we won't reveal his or her name yet. But keep an eye on our email. Thanks again, and see you next time.